the Indian media began to pick up things like, so Economic Times reported that he has links with the Hizb ut-Tahrir. This is one of the premises they use to sort of project Bangladesh's Talibanization. Interim government took over during the Awami League regime. Any journalist asking for a visa would have to wait a few weeks, if not more.
Yeah.
Right now, it's done almost overnight.
How can the Bangladeshi media and the government effectively counter the propaganda being spread by the Indian media?
It's difficult to counter for the government. It's difficult to counter that. They could encourage more journalists to actually report on it and report on it credibly and honestly and truthfully.
For almost 4 months, since the fall of Sheikh Hasina's regime, the Indian media has published an unprecedented number of reports on Bangladesh, a level of attention we've rarely seen before. Much of these reports have been criticized as misleading and often as propaganda. This has triggered many a question in the minds of Bangladeshis as well as Indians as part of the subcontinent's diaspora. What is actually happening in Bangladesh? And why is Indian media coverage so starkly different from that of Bangladeshi news outlets? We're going to answer these questions today in Star Views Room. I am Naziba Bashar, and with me is Tanim Ahmed, digital editor of the Daily Star. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
We're going to start off with the fact that Chief Advisor Dr. Muhammad Yunus stated that an open invitation had been extended to the Indian media a long time ago, allowing them to come to Bangladesh and report from the ground reality the situation in Bangladesh. However, there has been no official response, and yet we're seeing a lot of news coverage on the Bangladesh issue. What are your thoughts on this? And as a journalist, what do you think is the reason behind this?
If you look back to the initial days of this government and right after the fall of Sheikh Hasina regime, you remember that at first it seemed like the entire Indian establishment as well as the media establishment was in a state of shock, sort of a denial. They couldn't believe that this could ever happen. This led to sort of like a knee-jerk reaction, and we then saw a string of reports all trying to come up with different kinds of theories, I would say conspiracy theories, of who was behind this. At times it was the US, at times it was China, sometimes, and ISI of Pakistan was mentioned numerous times. So many times it felt like ISI had established cells in every sub-district of Bangladesh, if not every village. In different outlets, of course, Bangladeshi journalists spoke, but the projection was such that Bangladeshis do not really have much of an agency on their own. There had to be someone behind it. And with that, there was a narrative emerging that with Sheikh Hasina gone, Bangladesh is now becoming an Islamist country. It is becoming another Pakistan because the country is now heading towards Islamism or an Islamist state. Mind you, it's okay in India to have BJP in the government, which aspires for a Hindu state, which is secular, and that is fine. But if you dare to become Islamist, then you're by definition a violent extremist. You cannot be a peaceful Islamist state, is what was being suggested from the Indian media.
What is still being suggested globally almost, right?
Yes, it is. But particularly from India. And it's like if you become Islamist, you are by definition becoming a violent extremist. Whether I want to be an Islamist or not is a different debate. Becoming an Islamist could be my choice. It could be something else. But if it is, then an Islamist could very well be peaceful or inclusive or secular and have those values as well. That is another debate. However, so the narrative was such that that Bangladesh is now becoming an intolerant, increasingly Islamist, increasingly violent extremist society. And in that while this was going on, there were some reporters who came in, who reported from here, and who found out how the students had conducted the movement, how this was a long campaign, and so on. This discussion has been making its rounds. Sometimes it goes on a high, sometimes it's not heard of for much long. That this was like a well-conducted, deeply thought out, very well-planned, well-concerted move against the Awami League. One of those instances was when Professor Yunus himself said how it was a very well-planned movement from the very beginning in New York.
Right.
And he had at that point introduced Mahfouz as one of the masterminds behind this campaign. Mahfouz has been a victim of this concerted campaign of disinformation.
Right.
He is a sitting minister right now. He has been labeled as Hizb ut-Tahrir, as Hizb ut-Tawhid,
right,
and a member of or having links with Ansarullah Bangla team. In fact, some social media posts have claimed that his father is a leader of Hizb ut-Tawhid or something like that. At one point, from these social media posts, the media began to pick up, the Indian media began to pick up things like, so Economic Times reported that he has links with the Hizb ut-Tahrir. This is one of the premises they use to sort of project Bangladesh's Talibanization, or saying that Bangladesh is becoming increasingly Talibanized, and so on. Before this interim government took over, during the Awami League regime, any journalist asking for a visa would have to wait a few weeks,
right,
if not more.
Yeah.
Right now, it's done almost overnight. And there are special instructions from here, from the government, to the embassies to issue journalists visas immediately so that they can come here and report. And we've seen journalists come here on very short notice, right, getting visas and so on. Mm-hmm. So that was not something that was just for the cosmetic purpose that Professor Yunus said. There were moves to facilitate journalists to come here and report from the ground so that they could see and they could show their audience what was going on. Right. I think the reason for the chief advisor to ask and request Indian media establishment to come here and report from the ground is that unless you're on the ground, you tend to believe other things, and you tend to fall victim to other people's perceptions and what's happening. So if you have more journalists coming in and reporting from the ground, assumption was that the narrative would change.
Yeah.
But he told us in an interview a couple of weeks back, the narrative, however, unfortunately, it didn't really change. There have been some outlets who came here to report, and some reporters have gone back and reported on what they've seen, but not many.
So, but we keep pointing out at the disinformation spread by the Indian media. But are all their claims of minority persecutions entirely false? Is there really no persecution of minorities, specifically the Hindus, taking place in Bangladesh currently?
There certainly is.
Yeah.
It's being blown out of proportion.
Right.
Let me give you an example. The India Today had an interview of the press secretary of the chief advisor, Shafiqul Alam. He's a former journalist, known him from before. Now, the content and the style of the interview, I'll come to that later. Throughout the interview, this interview is following violence against Hindus in Chittagong because a Hindu monk was arrested and kept there, and his followers had tried to resist him being taken to jail. There was chaos and so on. So in the aftermath, 2 temples were allegedly vandalized. 1 lawyer was hacked to death. And so this is sort of the context, and this is where Shafiq is being interviewed by Gaurav Sawant. Now, throughout the interview, they keep showing footage and they keep showing picture of one lawyer, Ramin Roy.
Right.
And underneath it's written that ISKCON monk's lawyer or Chinmoy Krishnadas's lawyer, beaten, severely wounded in ICU and so on. That footage goes round and round, right? At first, the news or the propaganda was such that a Muslim man had been hacked to death for agreeing to represent Chinmoy.
Right.
Of course, that was proven false.
Right.
Now, the person who's being shown, Ramin Roy, is indeed a lawyer, but not Chinmoy's.
Not Chinmoy's.
He was in fact not even in Chittagong.
Right.
He was going with his friend on a rickshaw in Dhaka on an intersection where there was a protest and demonstration going on of Chinmoy supporters. And there was a chaos, there was people chasing other people, people beating up people. This poor gentleman got caught up in that. He had no idea of this, and he was not a participant in either of the protests,
Right.
not at least not by his affiliations, because he was not a member of any side or anything
Right.
like that. He was beaten badly. And then he ended up, and because he was bleeding from the head, and he did not get immediate treatment, which is very unfortunate, which is something we must report. And that is one of our, I would say, our failures. We'll come to that later too. But that Ramin Roy didn't get enough or sufficient treatment in time, which is why he is now in ICU in Dhaka. And he's in a very dire state, unfortunately. However, he has no links with Chinmoy.
Or the protests surrounding the arrest.
Nothing at all. And he's in a different city.
Right.
But that has been reported on India Today. It's being shown on India Today, and so on. What generally happens is you have most of these Indian news outlets, what they will do is you have an interviewee and you have the interviewer. In the middle, you have footage playing out. And they will begin asking, based on a premise that several hundred Hindus have been killed, thousands of houses have been torched, what is the government doing about it?
Right.
But nothing of the sort has happened. In all this footage, I have not seen the two temples that were vandalized.
Right.
See, one of these temples is not quite a temple. It's more like a prayer corner in a Hindu household, so there is this one lane in Chittagong through which a few hundred protesters, Muslim protesters of course, were opposed to ISKCON, they marched through. In the process, they broke into some of the Hindu homes, violating the sanctity of their privacy and their homes. Absolutely unfortunate and absolutely unacceptable. In one of these homes, in almost every Hindu home, you have a little place or a corner where you have for worshiping, for like a praying corner, a mandap. This home also had such a praying corner. It's like almost like a walk-in closet, and there's a door to it. The glass panel of the door was broken, and you could see the shards of glass lying on the floor. The idol inside wasn't broken, by the way. It's fine. However, even that much is not acceptable.
Right.
So that's one. The other temple is at a street corner from where some of the protesters threw a few brick chips. It's not like they had entered the temple and taken out everything or looted everything or set it on fire or anything like that. Through the alley, you see brick chips. I've seen brick chips lying about. So there was some violence. And there was some, of course, this intimidated the Hindu residents along that alley. And they had remained indoors. They were scared. And that is a fact. We have reported on it. Now imagine, it's a country of 180 million people with about 15 million Hindus or more than that. This is a few hundred people marching through a lane in a neighborhood following a serious incident where a Muslim man has been hacked. They believe by Hindus, they believe by ISKCON followers. This is something that unfortunately is something we've seen happen many times. It's not something we should be happy that this procession did not lead to a bloodbath.
Right. It could have easily led
It
to that
could have.
stage, yeah.
And immediately the police came in, the situation was contained. But naturally, the situation is tense there.
Yeah.
And that's how, now, we have reported it. We have reported, we should be, I would like us to be more nimble, like our Indian news outlets, which we are not. We're slow, and a lot of times we will have omissions, but those are not malified omissions.
Right.
We're trying to report what is happening on the ground. Unfortunately, it's being drowned out by this cacophony of disinformation. And this is where I will come to the point of the entire interview, where Shafiqul Alam was facing Gaurav Sawant. The interviewer appeared to be talking at his interviewee rather than talking to him,
Right.
let alone listen to the interviewee. He didn't get a chance to get a word in, Shafiq. And because of the premise, the beginning premise is that there's a pogrom, there's a genocide of Hindus going on, and now what is the government going to do about it? That, for government officials, it becomes difficult. And first of all, there's sometimes a knee-jerk reaction, no, that's not true. But instead, if you begin with something like, yes, there are things happen, it's not like this, it's not that. But it's difficult to have a fair chance of getting that word in,
Right.
when the interviewer on the other side is bent on showing, on creating panic and alarm.
Exactly.
And this is false alarm, I would say.
Yeah.
Also, in the last 4 months, it's become increasingly apparent that the Indian media establishment has lost what we would like to think as secular nature and become a Hindu
Yeah.
media establishment. It doesn't seem like they're worried about people in plight, poor people, the disadvantaged, the
Or the
marginalized.
minorities in their own country.
It's only the Hindus they're worried about,
Yeah.
which is okay. They're minorities too. And I believe as a member of the press, I am more obligated to uphold the rights of all minorities in my country rather than the majority, because it's the minorities who are always being disadvantaged and marginalized. So Hindus, Buddhists, or other ethnicities, indigenous, and so on, we should be committed to reporting on their welfare and well-being much strongly, which is something that seems to be absent in the Indian media establishment. I'm no one to comment on that. It's just that with all this disinformation and misinformation campaign, it's become very difficult for us to rely on any single media outlet except a few, like Hindu,
Right.
which is one of the outlets that reported just the other day that there have been no notable rise in incursion into India from Bangladesh since the changeover of the government. Whereas there was this sort of a campaign, or like you could feel that there's such a pogrom, there's such a genocide of Hindus going on, that there's an exodus,
Right,
people
yeah,
fleeing
yeah.
through the borders. Hindu has reported there's no such noticeable rise, which is one of the things. I mean, so you report what is going on the ground and try and do your job properly instead of doing this disinformation or misinformation campaign.
And also the aggression with which they are interviewing the Bangladeshi individuals, I think
Exactly.
that is very notable.
It depends from person to person, of course. If you I think there was another interview by Karan Thapar of Zafar Subhan. There have been many other interviews. Not all of them are aggressive or
Attacking in nature.
It's not. Some of the interviews seem to be a bit too much in your face, and what is noticeably what becomes sort of difficult, or you tend to notice that this is becoming sort of ugly when the interviewer keeps talking over the interviewee, and both of them start talking at the same time because no one's being
Heard.
heard.
No one's being
So
heard.
one is trying to talk over the other. It's like the Goswami school of journalism.
Okay, so we're seeing that how much this disinformation coming from the Indian news is actually going global to one point. This disinformation has reached Washington, it has reached the UK Parliament, it's being discussed everywhere. So how can the Bangladeshi media and the government effectively counter the propaganda being spread by the Indian media?
First, I don't think it's the responsibility of the media establishment to counter any propaganda.
Right.
Sometimes we are part of a propaganda, sometimes we unwittingly do something that feels like propaganda, but it's not our job to do
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Our job is to report what's going on the field.
Just facts.
On the ground,
Yeah.
yes. And of course, at the same time, with the facts, you present the context. Just like saying a few hundred people, you also have to mention that a few hundred people in a country of 180 million, or like say 2 deaths, to go to an extreme. 2 deaths in 2 months in 180 million people country is really, because not much, we have so many from accidents of violence and so on.
Right.
So you have to point out what is if there is a reasonable scope to say, yes, there is something wrong here. You also have to present the context. Right. Now, so yes, we report the facts. We tell our readers and our audience what is going on. That is the best we can do. We can also tell readers and our audience how to look at a certain event and what kind of the history behind it, sort of. That's our responsibility as journalists. This propaganda can only be countered with, I think, what is pretty much always the case, with the truth.
Right.
We tell the world what is happening on the ground. If houses have been burnt, we report that, and we have. If people have been killed, we report that, and we have. But we don't give it the impression that there are hundreds.
Right.
If there is a handful, and that too, the handful, that too would be
Specified.
4 or 5 too
Yeah.
many,
Yeah.
if there are. That is not acceptable in any way, of
Right.
course. So that's what the media can do. The government, I don't feel that I am qualified enough to be able to answer that question, what the government can do to counter this propaganda. But they should most certainly have regular spokespeople to talk to different media establishments and take speaking opportunities to present this side of the picture, also their side, their version. But then more than saying their version, because in these cases, independent journalists are far more credible than government officials who tend to play down
Right.
what's wrong in the country. So I mean, as a journalist, that's what I would think.
Right.
So it's difficult to counter for the government. It's difficult to counter that. They could encourage more journalists to actually report on it, and report on it credibly and honestly and truthfully. I think
So
that
the
would be
steps the government have already taken, such as inviting journalists from abroad, this is actually something that they should keep pursuing, you think?
It's something Shofik even mentioned yesterday or day before yesterday. So during the interview with India Today, he mentioned to Gaurav Sawant, why don't you come and report?
Right.
And immediately, so this is another thing that we turned it on its head. He was like, Munni Shah is a journalist. She was harassed on the streets. If you can't protect your own journalists, how are we going to go there? Now, of course, Munni Shah is someone who was visibly one of the strongest champions of the previous regime.
Right.
She's wont to be harassed on the streets. Of course, that's not acceptable. But people have had such bitter experience with the previous regime. Anyone who's connected to it.
But that had nothing to do with her religion. It was political
because
affiliation.
It was her political affiliation, and it's. I mean, yes, she was a journalist, and it was because of her bad journalism that she's being harassed on the streets. That is not acceptable at all. If she wants to be a stooge or a tool, she can very well do that. That's her right to do so. And I can hate her for that, but I have no right to
can't
close
assault her
down.
for it. Yeah.
Of course. But that was pointed out as something which is, which as if that is the entire Bangladesh.
Right.
That journalists are being harassed on the streets, and there is no safety or security. So one, yes, Nisha, it's not because of her religion, it's because of who she was, it's because of her political identity. But how many times can you make that point?
Right.
So this is also part of how the campaign is going on. But yes, if we have more journalists reporting from the ground, we will most certainly be able to put up a proper picture of what's going on. And with picture, I would say that yes, we have seen pictures of those two temples, and it's not what you would call vandalism.
Right.
It's like some wayward boys were,
or desecration of.
Yes, it wasn't that.
Yeah.
Of course, still whatever was done was not acceptable.
Right.
It will certainly instill fear among the worshippers, and the Hindus will not feel encouraged to go there in probably like in 1 or 2 days. But it's not like a huge big thing.
Like you said at the beginning, it's blown out of proportion.
Yes, absolutely blown out of proportion.
Thank you so much, Tanim Ahmed, for being with us today. For more updates and news analysis, click on the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for listening and watching. Stay with the Daily Star.